What is one thing women love to do besides promoting and siding with hot, evil men? Going once, going twice, it's siding with hot, evil women. Today we are looking at Lindsay Clancy trial by Crime is Fun, which is by Donut. So without further ado, let's begin.
What if I told you at this moment women on TikTok are angrily throwing ice cubes at their bathtubs,
Epic.
casting spells, and raising an insane amount of money because in 2023, a mother in Massachusetts allegedly strangled her 3 small children to death, one at a time with an exercise band.
From what I know is that she killed 3 kids. I didn't know about the exercise ban. I didn't know how she killed them, so she strangled them. That's fucking gnarly. I don't know who would fucking support that shit. That's bad. That's
I didn't
real
make any of
bad.
that up. All of those things are true. You see, 91% of my
My God,
audience
that's
is
so
male,
hot.
and you mostly fine gentlemen and a couple of amazing ladies out there may have heard your wife, girlfriend, sister, mom, or whoever
Yeah,
talk
totally.
about the case of Lindsay Clancy. There's a lot of speculation in the case that is causing a lot of people on TikTok to do some, let's say, very peculiar things. Well, around these here parts, crime is fun. Well, not actually doing crime, most crime, but
Well,
crime is
watching it,
certainly
watching
fun
it
to
is fun.
listen to. Let's
In
get
a
one
fucked up
thing
sort of
straight
way.
before we start. Postpartum depression is serious stuff that shouldn't be taken lightly. While researching
Obviously.
this, Google is even trying to get me to call a hotline for my postpartum depression.
But here's
With
what I'll
that
say.
being
This may be a fucked up analogy, but think of it like this. Postpartum depression is serious, but it doesn't excuse what she did, right? It's like saying, I can't believe I'm going to say this. It's like saying a guy who's attracted to little kids, which we can all agree that's some fucking mental illness bullshit. But then when he goes and commits the crime, we don't say, oh, but guys, he was attracted to kids. What was he supposed to do? We don't do that. So I feel like the same mindset should be kind of used in the same sense as Clancy. I keep saying Clancy Brown. Who the fuck is it? Lindsay Clancy?
said, I'm going to try and keep my opinions about killing 3 beautiful children to myself and just give you the facts of the whole Lindsay Clancy
Excellent.
incident, including some of the trial leading up to the recording of this video, which would be August 20th, 2026. Let's get into it. On a quiet street in Duxbury, Massachusetts, there's a house at 47 Summer Street that used to be full of noise. Kids' laughter, playing in the yard, having a great time. The mother of those children was Lindsay Clancy. She was born Lindsay Marie Musgrove on August 11, 1990 in Wallingford, Connecticut. She grew up to become exactly the kind of person you want in the room during the worst moments of your life. She trained as a nurse and spent 9 years working labor and delivery at the Massachusetts General Hospital. Colleagues remembered her as unshakable under pressure. The nurse who mentioned the new hires, the one who patients singled out by name, later said, "She was the best nurse I've ever had." A co-worker of 7 years would later testify that Lindsay loved being a nurse. She was really good at being a nurse. She was often visibly moved, even emotional, at the births of complete strangers. In 2013, she met Patrick
I think
Clancy.
that's crazy how, like, there wasn't any signs. Usually when you have someone who commits, like, this type of crime, there usually is, like, like, signs or weird oddities you can, like, kind of pinpoint that kind of indicates something may be wrong, I think which kind of makes this topic interesting because it goes into like how much did postpartum depression kind of influence her actions. Not saying excuses them, but influences her mind.
They moved in together 2 years later in September
And
of
I'm not really very
2015
knowledgeable about
and
it to
married
begin
in
with.
December of 2015. They settled into the house on Summer Street and started building a family. Cora arrived in December of 2017. Dawson William followed in September of 2019, and in May of 2022, their third child, Callan, was born. By every account, Lindsay had weathered postpartum anxiety before, and each time she'd managed it in the way a lot of new mothers do. She was doing therapy, exercising, seeing friends,
Okay.
touching grass, basically. It never stopped her from functioning, and it
touch
never
grass.
stopped her
Ew.
from being, in the words of everyone who knew her, a wonderful mother. She went back to work after Callan was born, and the family hired a nanny that summer to help out. By December, once it was clear Lindsay wasn't returning to the hospital, they let the nanny go. For the first few weeks after Callan was born, Lindsay seemed happy, energetic, and enthusiastic. She was throwing herself into early morning workouts and hanging out with the kid. In August of 2022, though, anxiety and depression hit her. She was having insomnia that wouldn't break and exhaustion so complete that her own parents flew in just to help hold the household together. 3 days
Yeah.
later, on September 15th, she
No,
had
hold that thought. How long does postpartum depression even last? because that seems like a big time frame. I'm going with AI because I have no credibility. At least 25% of women may experience elevated depression symptoms for 3 years after birth. That can't be right. So some moms may experience severe, long-lasting form of depression known as postpartum depression. Baby blues symptoms. Does it include killing your kids? Here we go. How long does postpartum depression last? Can last until 1 year. Okay, 1 year. So that's about what I expected. I expected about 1 year. 3 years seemed a little excessive.
Appointment with Dr. Jennifer Tufts, who was a psychiatrist. This doctor, who would later come out in court, had been practicing independently for only about a month at that point. She had treated only a handful of postpartum patients, despite marketing herself online as having expertise in the area. The diagnosis that day was generalized anxiety and adjustment disorder. The prescription was 25 milligrams of Zoloft,
okay,
which according to the internet is a reasonable conservative first move, and one this doctor would later testify was standard first-line treatment and safe for breastfeeding mothers. While the Zoloft didn't really hold, Lindsay initially balked all of the medication, wanting to try therapy first. By mid-October, it wasn't really working, and the dose went up to 50 milligrams, and within about a week, she'd gone to 48 hours without sleep. Her thoughts were racing, she was feeling foggy and increasingly afraid. At one visit, she said
I think the first dose of Zoloft was 25, so they went up a second dose.
One day become suicidal. They pulled her off Zoloft and tried Ativan and Benadryl instead. Then they tried Buspar and hydroxyzine. Then, after an emergency room visit in mid-November for an insomnia that wouldn't quit, they tried
pretty common, like, depressive, antidepressant, like, drugs so far. Nothing that I haven't ever heard of.
trazodone, which was pushed eventually to 150 milligrams. Then they went to Prozac, prescribed by a nurse practitioner named Julie Paul, who'd just taken over part of her care. Then within days of those being prescribed in late November, she went to Ambien, Remeron, and Klonopin. These were given to her from a provider meeting her for the first time. She told providers that the world had started to feel unreal, there was confusion and some memory problems. She said there was a sense of being disconnected from her own.
If you don't know anything about Ambien, that's incredibly, I've never heard of anyone being prescribed that since 2000. It's so addictive. I have family members that are still on it. They've been on it since, I think, like the 70s, and you see them do weird shit. It's
body, it's like spacey, she called it. By late November, she was having full panic attacks and was recommended for a partial hospitalization program. Her medical care transferred again, this time to a psychiatric nurse practitioner named Rebecca Jolata. This lady diagnosed postpartum anxiety and started her on Seroquel. Seroquel is an antipsychotic, and the dose eventually climbed to 400 milligrams a day. Her depression screening score using a standard postpartum scale were landing in the moderate to severe range. This depression screening score was 17 out of 30 by the end of November, and then 21 out of 30 a week later, and this was from different providers' accounts. She actually told a crisis counselor she was terrified of her own hallucinations. Twice in early December, she called a suicide and crisis hotline asking for help and was turned away both times, not because anyone doubted she was struggling, but because she couldn't articulate a specific plan to hurt herself, which is often the threshold crisis intake used to decide involuntary admission. Her husband was watching all of this happen in real time, and he was scared. He told providers she was 10,000 times worse since she had taken medication and suggested they stop everything and start from scratch. Instead, though, her Seroquel dose went up again. On December 12th, she wrote in a journal, 2.5 Valium, 200 Seroquel, slept well, horrible thoughts, and no motivation. By mid-December, she was writing things down that read like a mind in free fall, saying things like, I will not be the same, I want to die. She also said the only option is to die. Around the same time, she told both her husband and her mother that she had been having thoughts of harming the children. Her mother, looking very nervous, later testified it was almost like she was confessing something she was ashamed of. Lindsay started sleeping in her mother's bed some nights like a frightened child herself and became convinced at points that other people could somehow hear her thoughts. December 15th, later in court, was described as her worst day. Patrick called Dr. Gelada's office in a panic to report a crisis. Lindsay had gone to an emergency department and considered admitting herself to McLean Hospital right then. Instead, on Dr. Gelada's recommendation, she entered a day program at Women and Infants Hospital in Providence, Rhode Island. Patrick was driving there to see her and check up on her every single day.
Like, at this point, when there's so much escalation and she's having thoughts of harming others, it's one thing, like, it's still bad, obviously. We both know that. When you're harming yourself or you're thinking about harming yourself, when you're actively thinking of harming others, that's when it can, and it's progressing, That's a huge warning. I'm shocked they didn't like hospitalize her and they just did
day.
partial.
But roughly 5 days later, she was turned away. Doctors there concluded her symptoms looked less like postpartum depression and more like a woman who was dangerously over-medicated and possibly misdiagnosed. They separately ruled out the bipolar disorder as a working theory. Nobody apparently called Dr. Tufts to compare notes on any of it. On New Year's Day 2023, she self-admitted to McLean Hospital, which is one of the most respected psychiatric hospitals in the country, under the care of the attending psychiatrist named Dr. Aaliyah Goodhart. She had reported difficulty with sleeping, she felt numb, and was struggling with side effects from the drugs she was already on. She was then diagnosed with major depressive disorder and insomnia and monitored for possible bipolar disorder and sleep deprivation. Dr. Goodhart later explained on the stand that this can sometimes trigger a hypomanic episode. Lindsay denied having a suicide plan, telling doctors her children and her mother were reasons she wouldn't act. She ended up staying there for 5 days and was discharged on January 5th, 2023. The discharge notes described her insight and judgment as limited. She left anyway because she wanted to be home for the 5th birthday party for her daughter, Cora. She was sent home with a 2-week supply of Ativan and Trazodone. On cross-examination later on trial, Dr. Goodhart...
For those who don't know, Ativan's like, from what I know, it's like you know what, let me look it up. I don't want to fucking give bad description of Ativan. I butchered that name. I spelled advance. Son of a bitch. Hang on. Okay. Belongs to medications called benzodiazepine. La, 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 la. Yeah, to treat anxiety. So Ativan's the anxiety one. Then Trazodone's the sleep aid. Which, dude, I've taken Trazodone before. Don't tell anyone that. But it fucks you up. I felt hungover. Did I just fuck up the video?
January 5th, 2023. The discharge notes described her insight and judgment
I'm a new
as
YouTuber.
limited.
Give me
she
some
left
grace,
anyway
okay?
because she wanted to be home for the 5th birthday party for her daughter, Cora. She was sent home with a 2-week supply of Ativan and Trazodone. On cross-examination later on trial, Dr. Goodhart was pressed pretty hard on this one. They asked had McLean pulled Lindsay's prior records from her other providers, and they hadn't. They were just stacking on pills. They asked were they aware she'd called a suicide hotline twice before admission. Nope. Goodhart's answer essentially was that psychiatry doesn't run on blood tests, it runs on what a patient tells you. And Lindsay had, in her assessment, been a cooperative, forthcoming, reliable reporter of her own symptoms. For the next 2.5 weeks, Lindsay kept going to her appointment. She kept telling her doctor she wasn't having thoughts of suicide or of hurting anyone. And she kept trying new medications, and on January 16th, she started amitriptyline and told Dr. Tufts that bonding with her infant son had felt forced. Around this same period, in a note on her phone, first written in late December and revised again days before the killing, she'd written, "Medication stole my motherhood and my life." Also in that note, she described the earlier Zoloft increase, saying, "I couldn't sleep a wink." She also described the period right after starting Ativan and Benadryl, said that's when everything started going downhill. On January 23rd, the day before everything happened, the murders.
It kind of reflects the current landscape of the medicine field, where it's just not necessarily solving the issue, but solving it solely via medication. And there's more issues that are brought upon the medication you take. It's not finds a new solution. It's, well, let's give you different medication to counteract the symptoms of the current medication. So it just stacks and stacks and stacks. I really think, the system failed her, and it's so far it's a tragic story.
She saw Dr. Tufts one final time. They said she was exhausted and barely able to get herself out of bed, and she was still denying every single time that she had any thoughts of hurting herself or her children. Her amitriptyline dose was raised again on the way to the door.
Shit.
By the end of it, across roughly 4 months, Lindsay Clancy had been prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications across more than 30 individual prescriptions. These were issued by rotating...
Hang on, I'm going back. How many? What was the time frame?
Raised again on the way to the door. By the end of it, across roughly 4 months, Lindsay Clancy had been prescribed 13 different psychiatric medications across more than 30 individual prescriptions. These were issued by a rotating cast of psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, emergency room doctors, and inpatient staff.
Well, I will say this. It's bad when you're not going to the same... You're not talking to the same people. It looked like she was kind of going through the system, filtering, cycling, and they were just giving her different medications based off their own, based off what she said, and based off their what they had on hand. Like he was saying, they didn't have records from her previous hospitalization meetings or previous psychiatric meetings.
Every account given at her criminal trial were not coordinating with one another. Dr. Tufts alone wrote nearly half of those 30-something prescriptions. And the next day, Lindsay Clancy killed all three of.
Never mind. It looked like the one chick wrote most of those prescriptions. Damn. That doesn't seem right. That seems... Is that common? That can't be common, right? That can't be common.
Her children. Let's go to that day, January 24th, 2023. It didn't look like the last normal day of anyone's life. It looked, by every account gathered afterward, a good day, maybe even one of her best days in months. That morning, Lindsay took 5-year-old Cora to a routine pediatrician's visit. Dr. Lindsay Rosehurst, a pediatrician who'd known the family since 2019, would later testify it was about as unremarkable an appointment as they come. She said Cora was well behaved and Lindsay engaged inappropriate, and the two of them discussing a stubborn stomachache that a children's laxative might fix. Normal kid stuff. The kid was holding in poop, and Rosehurst said without hesitation, "At the stand, I always thought she was a good mom." That afternoon, Lindsay took Cora and 3-year-old Dawson out into the snow in the backyard. They built a snowman together, and she photographed it and sent the pictures to her mother and to Patrick. Normal mom behavior. We're going to get into what her phone was saying. This is all taken by police and forensic evidence. At around 4 in the afternoon, her phone shows her searching for children's Miralax because the baby couldn't poop. Then she checked a drive time estimate to a restaurant called 3V. At around 4:47, she called the local CVS pharmacy in nearby Kingston to ask about the laxative's availability. Angela Kraus, the store manager at CVS who took that call, would later describe it as a very normal interaction. Nothing that sounded impaired, nothing off about her voice at all. At 4:53, she texted Patrick, "Is there any chance you want to do takeout from 3V? I didn't cook anything. It's been a long day." He asked, "Well, what do you want, honey?"
Nothing like
She said
suspicious.
she wanted a Mediterranean power bowl, and at 5:10, she called 3V directly and placed the order herself. Saria Sweeney, the hostess that took the call, remembered it for the same reason everyone else did. It was completely unremarkably normal. A little after 5, Patrick left the house to run the errand his wife had asked him to run. The last thing he remembered seeing on the way out was Dawson on the couch eating chicken nuggets and green beans. Surveillance footage picked him up walking
But then
into
again, like I will say, when you have someone that's dealing with thoughts like that, even though she was very like outspoken, they're not always forthcoming. Many people try to hide their symptoms, whether they be just embarrassed by them. It's a private issue or private matter. They're not going to always advertise if they're having these serious thoughts of harming themselves or others.
Kingston CVS at around 5:32. He called Lindsay from inside the store at around 5:33 to check which medicine to buy. She didn't pick up the first time, but on the second call, which was about 14 seconds long, she told him what to get. He later described her as sounding quiet, kind of like busy, like she was in the middle of something. He checked out and left the store at around 5:37 carrying Pedialax and a bag of Skittles. He then drove roughly 10 minutes to the restaurant, and cameras caught him walking into 3V restaurant at around 5:54. Sometime during this window, Lindsay Clancy brought her 3 children down to the basement one at a time and strangled each of them with a resistance exercise band. Cell phone and smartwatch data recovered later would show 2 separate trips up a flight of stairs inside the house, clustered at around 5:33 and 5:38. This is data that prosecutors would eventually argue marked the 2 trips it took to bring the children down. Then she went back upstairs, she cut her wrists and the left side of her neck, climbed out through the second floor bedroom window, and either fell or jumped roughly 13 feet to the frozen ground below. Patrick then got home sometime between 6 and 6:09.
See, that's new to me, because see, I thought she had strangled, like, she killed the kids, and then she attempted suicide. Oh, I can't say that on YouTube. Attempted in-game via Minecraft, but it was like a soft attempt. But this seemed like it was a pretty serious attempt.
When he got home, the house was quiet and felt wrong. He couldn't say exactly why. In his own words later, he said it was just eerily quiet. He went upstairs and found blood on the bedroom floor near an open window, and he called down towards the basement with no answer. He went outside and found his wife laying in the backyard and said, "What did you do?" She told him that she had tried to off herself. He called 911 at 6:11 p.m. after several agonizing minutes of spotty call service that delayed the call from connecting. The 911 recording, later played to the jury and never released to the public, runs somewhere between 6 and 7 minutes long. It captures his entire world ending in real time. You can hear him say, "Lindsay, what did you do? Where are the kids, Lindsay?" And her voice, barely coherent, said, "I tried to myself." He told the dispatcher his wife had later tried to commit suicide, describing her wound at one point as not really bleeding, as just an open wound. Then he said on the 911 call, "I've got to go check on my kids." And that's when the call changes completely. It's a father saying, "I need help in the basement right now. She killed the kids." He said it over and over with his voice breaking. "She killed the kids. Oh my God." Police arrived within roughly 7 to 10 minutes of the call. Officer Stephen Hall, who is an 11-year veteran of the Duxbury Police Force, found Lindsay on the ground on one side of the backyard. He stated she was in and out of consciousness with cuts on both wrists and the left side of her neck, none of them actively bleeding. He said she was able to make pained sounds but not to speak clearly. The officer heard Patrick screaming inside. He and Officer Brian Josephine ran through the kitchen towards the basement stairs, where they found the dad repeating, "I can't wake them up. I can't get them up." The basement they found him in the home doubled as a gym and home office for the dad. Around the same time, Fire Captain PJ Hussey, glancing through the basement window from outside, saw Patrick trying to pull an exercise band off of one of the children's necks. He immediately radioed every unit available, saying it turned very chaotic very quickly. Of the three children, only 8-month-old Callan still had a detectable pulse. It was very faint, but it was there. Cora was found face down with a band around her neck, and Dawson was found in Patrick's home office area, also with a band around his neck. Paramedics then carried all three children out to the ambulance. Jennifer Stratton, one paramedic, later described scooping the baby up in her arms and carrying him outside, and testified that he never regained a pulse in the field. Dawson wasn't breathing when he reached the ambulance, and firefighters performed CPR on him the entire ride. They went to Beth
I will
Israel.
say, people say, well, he doesn't have a pulse. Why do you still do like CPR? Well, you'd be surprised. The body is extremely resilient. I know we all, on YouTube, as compared to like other animals, we're pretty like soft, but you'd be surprised. People can you can resuscitate someone if you do CPR. You have a pretty decent shot.
Deaconess Hospital in Plymouth, where Dr. Mark Tenerowicz worked on Dawson for roughly 40 minutes. They gave Dawson adrenaline, calcium, and everything they had, but ruptured blood vessels already covered the boy's face from strangulation, and he never had a chance. Cora arrived without a heartbeat and without breath. Both of these children were pronounced dead that evening at 7:28 p.m. Callan's heart was restarted about after 10 minutes of resuscitation, but he never breathed on his own again. Later in court, they showed images of massive brain swelling. One Boston children's doctor later testified, "When you see swelling that early, that means there was a significant lack of oxygen." This child was flown by a helicopter to Boston's Children's Hospital, where he lingered on life support for 3 days before being declared brain dead. He died on January 27th, 3 days after his mother strangled him in the basement of their home. Per the state medical examiner, the official cause of death for all three children was asphyxiation due to strangulation, with Callan's death classified specifically as a complication of that asphyxia. So Lindsay, despite cutting herself and jumping out of a second-story window, didn't die that night. She came close, but what was left of her body when doctors finally stabilized her tells its own story. Her core temperature had dropped to somewhere around 82 degrees Fahrenheit, so a level of hypothermia doctors later called severe. She fractured her spine at both the cervical and thoracic level. The cervical injury was later described in court as a Jefferson fracture, which is a fracture of the topmost vertebrae, more commonly associated with a head-first landing. So a nosedive, basically. She was eventually airlifted.
It was a serious attempt. Not that that justifies what she did by any stretch, but you have seen cases where someone kills someone and then they attempt a game end, but it's a very weak attempt. This seemed like a very, what's the word? I guess serious attempt. Genuine
more
attempt.
Advanced care, and doctors placed a chest tube in her, gave her multiple blood transfusions, and at one point her heart stopped altogether, requiring chest compressions to bring her back. Forensic pathologists who reviewed her records later said that the wounds to her wrists and necks where she cut herself were superficial and not deep. They weren't life-threatening on their own, closer to what's clinically described as hesitation marks. It's a pattern that is sometimes seen in attempts. When the dust later settled, Lindsay Clancy was paralyzed from the waist down. From that moment on, she was a paraplegic with no expectation of ever regaining function below her abdomen or walking again. In the years since, Lindsay has separately filed a medical malpractice lawsuit against several of the providers and institutions that treated her in the months leading up to the killings. This would include her psychiatrist and a nurse practitioner, along with McLean Hospital and other facilities. That civil case remains pending, held largely on the shadow of a much larger criminal trial. That is, though, a part of the same underlying argument Lindsay's defense would spend years building for the trial that's happening right now. That defense was a woman walked into a psychiatrist's office in September 2022, anxious but functional, but 4 months and 13 medications later, she was unrecognizable even to herself. She was arraigned 2 weeks later on February 7, 2023. Right away, she pled not guilty, and a prosecutor stood up and told the court she planned these murders, gave herself the time and privacy to commit these murders, and then strangled each child in the place where they should have felt the safest, at home.
Wait. I gotta read that again. She admitted? I mean, yes, she did it, obviously, but I'm saying it
Later
was
on
planned?
February 7, 2023. Right away, she pled not guilty, and a prosecutor stood up and told the court she planned these murders, gave herself the time and privacy to commit these murders,
I missed that.
and then strangled each child in the place where they should have felt the safest, at home with their mother. Her attorney, 75-year-old Massachusetts defense lawyer Kevin Reddington, stood up and said the opposite, that she's been thoroughly destroyed by more than a dozen psychiatric medications and that it was clearly a product of mental illness. He said Lindsay Clancy, whatever she had done, loved her children. He then would spend the next 3.5 years building that argument one hearing at a time. What followed was more than 3 years of hospital transfers, competency evaluations, and legal maneuvering, most of it happening far from public view. It was one procedural fight bleeding into the next. Lindsay had moved from Brigham and Women's Hospital to Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital that March, and by that spring, she'd been transferred again to Tewksbury State Hospital. This was a Department of Mental Health facility where she would remain without bail for years until trial. That May, following what's called a Section 18 hearing, a judge ordered her held there for a minimum of 6 months. In September of 2023, a Plymouth County grand jury formally indicted her on 3 counts of murder and 3 counts of strangulation. She was arraigned again in Superior Court that October, appearing remotely from Tewksbury, that medical facility she was in. Now she was appearing before the judge who would oversee the case from then on. That was Judge William Sullivan. At that hearing, a prosecutor made a remark about the authenticity of her suicide attempt, saying, "I don't think she took into account the fact the ground was frozen." Her attorney's response was, "It's readily apparent that this woman was a troubled soul." Through 2024, the case moved in small increments. There were hearings over the sheer volume of discovery material. There was a January 2024 motion approving a DNA cheek swab. That waived court appearances because the logistics of transporting a paralyzed, hospitalized defendant were genuinely difficult. At one of those hearings, a judge found she posed a serious risk of imminent self-harm, which became part of the record supporting her continued hospitalization rather than a jail cell. More than a year and a half after the killings, her attorney filed on December 13, 2024 in writing that Lindsay would present a defense of lack of criminal responsibility. That's the formal name, basically. It's an insanity defense. This defense doesn't dispute that she did it. It concedes the act and argues instead that her mental state at that moment made her legally incapable of understanding right from wrong, or incapable of controlling her actions, even if she did understand. You've all seen court shows. If the jury accepts it, then she doesn't go to prison. She'll be committed to a psychiatric hospital indefinitely, subject to periodic safety review, rather than going to prison. That filing set off a bunch of fights that would eat up most of the following year and a half. There was a fight over how the government's own psychiatric experts would be allowed to evaluate her. Things like whether their standardized testing sessions could be recorded, whether the defense could at least watch the live feed, all tangled up in copyright concerns over proprietary test materials. At the same time, there was a separate legal battle with the New Yorker magazine. Prosecutors were trying to understand Patrick Clancy's state of mind and credibility, so they subpoenaed a contributing writer named Aaron Orby, who had profiled Patrick for an October 2024 article. The prosecution was seeking raw interview notes, audio recordings, and correspondences with Patrick, his family, and friends. The magazine's publisher, Condé Nast, fought the subpoena as a violation of New York's Reporter Shield Law and the First Amendment. They called it a fishing expedition. A judge initially sided, though, with prosecutors and ordered disclosure. The Boston Globe's own editorial board weighed in against the DA's office, accusing it of undermining the free press. I told you guys, this is a shit show. But hey, people on TikTok said this one thing, though. In the end, after months of legal wrangling over improper service, the original subpoena was withdrawn and quashed. Prosecutors were told to reissue it properly in New York, and as far as public reporting shows, they never successfully did. That fight kind of fizzled out. Just something I thought I should throw in there. There's a lot going on in this case. I understand why people are...
I mean, it makes sense. It's been going on for how many years now? Like, it kind of makes sense. There is so much of a shit show going on when you have that much time that's been dragged out. I mean, it's not completely unheard of, but it's been... So much has gone on that I've almost forgotten half the information Donut has told me so far.
Slightly confused. That's why I'm here going from the beginning
Donut.
to what we have today on August 20th, 2026. At the same time, there was a more human fight over how to physically get a paralyzed woman to and from a courthouse for a trial expected to run 6 to 8 weeks. Her attorney argued she needed medically trained two-person assistants for transfers, that she can't use a handicapped bathroom stall that she needed, and in his words, a nurse that's not a veterinarian. Basically, what it looks like to me is, hey, she needs specialized people to be with her at all times, so no, she can't come do this stuff. The county sheriff's office responded and proposed a standard wheelchair accessible van. Her attorney Reddington pushed back hard on that, warning the court at one hearing she's not a danger to others, but she's surely a danger to herself. If this woman kills herself during this trial, which there is a very real probability that could happen, it's on somebody and it's not on me. This dispute dragged on privately, wasn't open to the public through multiple disputes, but by the time the trial actually started, some workable arrangements had clearly been reached because she did appear in court in her wheelchair every day that it was in session. There's another fight. It was over whether the trial should even be a single trial at all. In February of 2026, her attorney Reddington filed a motion asking Judge Sullivan to split the proceedings into two separate phases. Those phases would be one jury phase to decide simply whether she committed the killings, and a second phase, if necessary, to decide whether she was legally responsible for them. In a March 2026 hearing, his argument was, if Your Honor denies the motion, we try the case the way they're all tried. Then I have an obligation to present evidence consistent with a lack of criminal responsibility, and that will obviously implicate criminal liability. Prosecutors countered that there's no constitutional right to split a trial, that the two phases would be nearly identical in substance, and that such motions are almost always denied. At the end of March 2026, Judge Sullivan agreed with the prosecution. His ruling was the two issues were overlapping and didn't require separating, that splitting the evidence cleanly between two phases would be nearly impossible, and a single trial was the most efficient and least confusing way to present the case to a jury. One trial, one jury. Guilt and sanity argued side by side in front of the same 12 people. In February of 2026, Lindsay made her first in-court appearance since her arrest 3 years earlier. Every other hearing before that had been conducted remotely by video from her hospital bed or her room at the psychiatric hospital. She was wheeled into the courtroom by sheriff's deputies dressed in a black suit and sat largely silent through the proceeding. Along the way, the trial date itself moved repeatedly from an initial target in late 2025 to January 2026 to February 2026, and finally, after a November 2025 hearing, citing the sheer volume of expert reports and discoveries still outstanding, to July 20th, 2026. At that same hearing, Judge Sullivan also denied a defense request to move the trial out of Plymouth County entirely over concerns about how saturated local coverage of the case had become. The judge noted the coverage was available statewide regardless of the venue where the trial was being held at. We're finally getting to present time here. By early July 2026, with the trial bearing down, the district attorney's office quietly dropped the 3 strangulation charges, not really as an act of mercy, but because, as a spokesperson put it, the murders of the 3 Clancy children resulted from strangulation. The charges would be subsumed into the murder charges indicted and therefore redundant. Now we're back to being left with the 3 counts of first-degree murder heading into the trial. 1 for little Cora, 1 for little Dawson, and 1 for little Callan. Jury selection took roughly 4 days in late July. By multiple accounts, it was an unusually emotional process, with a handful of prospective jurors reduced to tears during questioning. Some of them even asked to be excused on the spot, with 2 of the 18 people initially seated being replaced at the last minute. Lindsay herself sat in the witness box during parts of the jury questioning so she could hear. In the end, 18 jurors were seated, 12 who would deliberate, with 6 alternatives, 12 women and 6 men. The judge ruled that the 911 call that you're never going to hear and the children's autopsy photographs at the request of Patrick Clancy himself, father, would be impounded, which means barred from being recorded, displayed, and distributed by the media. It was for the court and the jury alone. Yeah, the dad didn't want the pictures of his dead children
kids
getting out to the
Go
press.
figure.
So on July 27, 2026, 3.5 years after the
shit.
3 children died in that basement, the trial finally began. Let's talk about the trial that, as of today, looking at my phone about an hour ago, actually, there are multiple women, dozens of women wearing pink, standing outside the courthouse, holding up little heart hands, providing their support for Lindsay. Some of them are even holding their children. Let's get to the trial. The prosecutor who delivered the opening statement, Assistant District Attorney Shannon Buckingham, didn't waste time softening any of it. She called Lindsay Clancy controlling, meticulous, and manipulative and laid out the state's theory in plain terms. That Lindsay had deliberately engineered her husband's absence that evening, meaning the CVS run, the takeout dinner, all of it timed and requested by her specifically to buy herself more time and privacy to kill her children before staging her own attempt to follow. Lindsay's attorney Reddington opened with a very different defense. He said, normally I'd thank you to the jury, and said, but in this case, God bless you. He didn't dispute what happened in that basement. He never would throughout the entire trial. A few days into the trial, the defense formally stipulated to most of the physical facts of the killings, specifically to avoid dragging dozens of redundant chain of custody witnesses throughout the courtroom. What he disputed from the opening was why. He argued there was no motive, no history of harming her children, nothing in this woman's life before that afternoon except a mother being consumed slowly and then all at once by a chemical and psychiatric collapse that the people treating her kept missing, minimizing, or catching too late. Patrick Clancy, dad, took the stand first, and his testimony ran through the second day of trial. He described watching his wife disappear into her illness that autumn. He said, in rough shape, she wasn't talking much, she had low energy and was really depressed. He said the December medication changes were where her big spiral started. He described her disclosing thoughts of hurting the children and asking her in that moment whether she thought she needed to be kept away from them. She said no. He said the next minute she was making them lunch or putting them to bed. During the trial, he said more than once without hesitation that he never once saw her hurt them, not even a flicker of it right up until the day it happened. He pointed to the signs he'd taken as real improvement in the weeks before. There was a family trip to the Museum of Science on January 8th. There was a stay at Cape Cod Resort on January 15th where her mood seemed noticeably better. There was a ski day on January 16th where he felt comfortable enough to leave the younger two alone with her while he was on the slopes with Cora. He testified on the day itself she was having one of her best days. During cross-examination, the defense attorney Reddington pressed him gently on the medication question, saying, did he watch her take every single pill? He stated, I was not standing next to her every time she took pills. Prosecutors, for their part, entered photographs of prescription bottles
that's a
showing...
good little, note to keep it in mind, because if she feels like the medicine's causing her to act like this and causing these side effects, her husband's thinking the same thing. I know people they may think, oh, well, let me stop taking it. Let me cut it down. So they kind of play their own doctor, which is a very dangerous game to play.
Large quantities dispensed, but comparatively few pills actually missing. It was evidence they used to argue she hadn't been taking her medication as consistently as the defense would suggest. And then, of course, there was the surveillance footage. It showed the CVS timestamps, the restaurant timestamps of Patrick going in there, the drive times mapped down to the second. It corroborated everything Patrick had said about where he was and when during the stranglings.
Well,
on
course,
day two came the
he wasn't
911 call
involved.
itself, played for the jury and no one else. Lindsay turned her face to the courtroom wall and sobbed audibly through the entire recording. Reports state that several jurors were visibly shaken by that 911 call also. Patrick asked to step outside before it played, and the judge warned the jury beforehand that whatever they were about to feel, they had to set it aside from the evidence itself. On day 3, they brought in the first responders. That would be the paramedics, the officers, the fire captain that was there. They described in devastating detail exactly what they found in that basement and the backyard. Day 4 sent the jury out to the actual house on Summer Street in small groups to see the scene before themselves. They went through the bedroom, they saw the window she jumped out of, and the basement where the children were killed before returning to hear emergency room doctors described almost by beat the 40 minutes spent trying and failing to save Dawson, and then the 10 minutes it took to restart Callan's heart before realizing his brain had already gone still. On day 5, they brought in her private journal entries. These were read aloud by both sides for very different purposes. Prosecutors read the journal entries as evidence of intent rather than illness. Entries like, I feel like I'm drowning every day, or I want to die. The defense read entries emphasizing the same crisis but from an opposite angle. Entries like, I have no appetite, I don't know what's wrong with me, I have crazy brain fog, I feel completely disconnected from my baby. On day 6, the forensic evidence was introduced to the court. Forensics like the bloodstain pattern analysis walking the jury through the smears found on the bedroom windowsill and the exterior siding beneath it, debating openly in court whether the pattern was consistent with a straightforward fall. On cross-examination, the defense attorney Reddington raised the argument that a controlled hand-over-hand climb down the exterior would have left a continuous smear the entire way down the siding, rather than the isolated contact points investigators actually found. The toxicology reports came back clean of everything except her own prescribed medication. Toxicology came back, there was no alcohol, there was no illicit drugs, and nothing at all in either children's systems. A state trooper testified that 4 pill bottles were recovered from the kitchen the night of the killings, and that 9 more described as discontinued prescriptions were handed over by Patrick's attorney nearly 2 weeks later. On day 7, the defense brought in a toxicology expert who testified that her medication levels were consistent with therapeutic prescribed doses rather than anything approaching a dangerous or suicidal concentration. They said that blood levels alone without clinical context don't tell the entire story. On the same day, the family's former nanny also testified, saying Lindsay was a wonderful mom who loved her kids and was very concerned with their safety. Day 8 brought in the medical examiner's account of Callan's autopsy, whose injuries, of course, were consistent with mechanical asphyxia. The pictures weren't shown to the gallery or the public, only to the jury. Reports say at that point, Lindsay cried loudly and had to be walked through a recess, while several jurors wiped away tears of their own. They also brought in Cora's pediatrician, 3 of the children's preschool teachers, a former father-in-law, a longtime nursing colleague, a family therapist, and several old friends. Nearly all of them, regardless of which side had called them, described the same 2 things in the weeks and months before the killings. That it was a mother who was unmistakably devoted to her children, and a mother who was unmistakably, visibly
He's kind of redundant here, and I think you kind of have to be when you're going through a case like this, because it's not like 2 different people are saying 2 different things. We both know what events occurred, right? It mostly comes down to whether or not she was in the right state of mind in the events leading up to it. Does it state that sorry, first time YouTuber, it's fucking hard, okay? The biggest thing is looking at the evidence and saying, is this a form of mental health issues that you can solely blame on, or is there some type of responsibility she needs to take for carrying out these horrible actions?
struggling, that she had gotten thinner, quieter, and exhausted. Days 9 through 13 belonged almost entirely to the medical providers who had actually treated her. They walked the court through every appointment. Dr. Goodhart and Dr. Tufts laid out nearly every visit from September through January in sequence. They even brought in nurse practitioner Julie Paul, who years earlier had prescribed some of the earliest medications. They brought in nurse practitioner Rebecca Gelada, who had pushed the Seroquel dose highest of anyone and who testified that Lindsay never indicated she had a plan to hurt herself or her children at any point in their work together. Nearly every one of them, though, under cross-examination was forced to admit a gap. They had never been communicating with each other. None of them had ever requested a record from each other. There had never been a HIPAA release signed. None of these people who prescribed this medication were treating her never talked to each other. During this time, a mountain of digital evidence was produced to the court, too. There was a state police cybercrime investigator who traced a suicidal method website access on the household laptop back to August 23rd to 2022, months before the killing. There was a cell phone forensics expert who cataloged a stream of increasingly specific searches in Lindsay's final weeks, like psychosis, hallucinations, benzo withdrawals. Can you treat a sociopath? This is alongside notes Lindsay had put into her phone.
I'm curious if, because we talked about a little bit with her kind of playing doctor and taking herself off certain medications. When she's asking withdrawal symptoms, I'm wondering if she had started going off of medication on her own without the advice of medical professionals.
Like, I am strong. I will overcome postpartum anxiety. I'm waiting for the day I wake up feeling like me. The prosecutor's case ended on day 14 after calling roughly 70 witnesses across 13 days on trial. Its final witness was a digital forensics expert who walked the jury through Apple Watch data. This data was heart rate elevated through the afternoon of January 24th, then 2 separate flights of stairs climbed within a 5-minute window around 5:33 and 5:38 p.m. along with phone searches from days earlier reading ketamine for suicidal ideation and symptoms of postpartum psychosis. Prosecutors used that data to argue their central theory outright that Lindsay had planned that evening to take her own life and had decided in that same window to take her children with her rather than leave them motherless. Immediately after the prosecution rested, the defense attorney Reddington asked the judge for an outright acquittal. He argued that the evidence clearly and unequivocally showed a woman suffering from mental illness rather than committing a calculated crime. The judge outright denied that, and the case moved on to the defense. What followed over the final 3 days covered here was the defense's most direct answer to the insanity question. Family members then took to the stand. Her sister, who is a social worker, described Lindsay as feeling numb and feeling hopeless in the weeks before, and at a birthday party 2 weeks before the killing, simply going through the motions. Lindsay's mother took to the stand, describing a desperate October text that read, "I'm really sick, something is wrong, I don't want to be alone." That's when her mom flew back to stay with her for a week. Her mother said weeks later, Lindsay looked at both her and Patrick and said nervously, "I have to tell you guys something," that she was having thoughts of harming the children. Her former mother-in-law took to the stand, who is a nurse of 40 years, and read into the record a text Lindsay had sent her that said, "I'm not okay and I'm terrified of taking meds tonight." She said Lindsay was struggling. We were all very concerned about her. A forensic psychiatrist who reviewed her medical file testified that the records were thin, heavy on checkboxes, and light on real clinical narrative, and that no one along the way had ever run basic blood or thyroid tests that might have caught a physical cause for what was happening to her. He raised bipolar disorder as a serious, underexploited possibility and noted that antidepressants alone are considered the wrong treatment for bipolar depression, which typically calls for mood stabilizers instead. A forensic pathologist appeared by video and walked the jury back through the physical evidence of the jump itself. Physical evidence like the spinal fracture, the severe hypothermia from laying outside in the winter, and the hesitation marks on her wrists and neck. They testified that all of this was consistent with a genuine sewer slide attempt. On cross-examination, prosecutors pushed back hard though, pointing out that despite a roughly 13-foot fall in the frozen ground, there was no bump, no scrape, no bleeding on her brain at all. Reports say the single most important defense witness was a...
In siding with the defense on that, most people will not know how big of a jump do you need to make to game in yourself. So it's kind of difficult to really... I think it was a serious attempt. If I had to decide, I think it was a serious attempt. Probably couldn't. Her hesitation marks probably proved that she couldn't do it that way, so she went with a more drastic approach. If I had to choose.
Forensic psychologist named Dr. Paul Ziesel. He was the only expert on either side who had actually spent meaningful time with Lindsay in person, meeting with her more than 45 times beginning just days after the killing, continuing through her transfer to Tewksbury Medical Facility. He testified that standard psychological testing showed no evidence whatsoever that she was faking or exaggerating her symptoms. He stated she was not faking, she presented as an honest citizen. And he prescribed in detail a phone call he personally facilitated between Lindsay and Patrick from her hospital bed in early February 2023, which would be about 2 weeks after the killings, where she told her husband that she loved him but struggled to express any emotion and disclosure. She also disclosed for the first time that she'd heard a male voice ordering her and telling her that she had no choice, that she had to kill her children and then herself. His diagnosis, delivered near the very end of the testimony, was she had bipolar disorder with postpartum psychosis. His opinion, stated plainly to the jury, was that on January 24, 2023, Lindsay Clancy was unable to tell right from wrong and unable to conform her behavior to the law, even if she had understood it. Prosecutors came after that testimony hard during cross-examination. They asked him directly, does any medical record from any of the dozen-plus providers who saw her during the 5 months before the killing document her hearing a voice telling her to kill anyone? Ziesel had to concede that that was nowhere. That specific detail existed only in what she told him weeks after the fact, not in anything she told a single doctor beforehand. The prosecution made a point where if she did ever hear these voices, did she ever seek help for them? And in the most recent day covered here in this video, just me talking about everything that happened, the trial did something pretty unusual. Partway through the afternoon, with no explanation offered to the jury or the press, the judge sent everyone home early, citing only an unforeseen circumstance. The judge told jurors not to speculate about why. Court resumed the next morning as though nothing had happened, and right now, whatever it was hasn't become public. That's roughly where the record currently stands, and as of today, I believe it's the 16th day of trial. It's the middle of the defense's case. There have been no closing arguments. No verdict has been reached, and the judge has indicated that the trial could run several more weeks before it's over. Without putting my own opinions in here, I said at the beginning I wasn't going to put my own opinions in here. I just wanted to lay out the facts that they have right now, the facts available to the public. So there it is. The trial isn't over yet. We're just going to have to wait and see what happens. I just want everyone to remember TikTok is not a reliable source, just like
It
a guy
is.
on YouTube isn't a very reliable source.
No,
other
you
than
are. I
read
love you, Don.
exactly what is out there at the moment. And that's all I have for this episode of Crime is Fine.
Thank you, Donut. We love you. No, but in all seriousness, man, there's a little video. If you want to go, I go watch it, sub, like. This is a great channel. I love it. But I'm trying to think of what to say, and I don't have a good answer. On one part of me, it's like the system failed her. Mentally, she was not in her right mind. And that should be taken into account. But on the other hand, you can't forgive the crime that was committed. There has to be some repercussions. And I think from the prosecution standpoint, I think they're arguing, and I could be wrong here, is that she planned it because that day she woke up feeling depressed. She planned to kill her kids, then game in herself. That was the plan. That's what she put in motion. I think that's what they're trying to argue. I could be wrong. And obviously the defense is saying, oh, it was a more of like an instinctual, in the moment thing. She wasn't in her right mind. She was in psychosis. But I'm glad I'm not on that jury, because that's a very. I think if I had to choose, I would convict her. I don't think the insanity plea will work out. But yeah, if you like the video, give it a like, give it a sub. I really enjoy this type of content. A lot more fun to react to versus just normal body cam. But yeah, see you guys. Peace.